Today, we're joined by Federico Pendenza, a researcher and educator at the University of York. Federico completed an MA in music education and a PhD at York, where his doctoral research examined how the Alexander Technique is understood and experienced across UK higher education music institutions. The paper of his that we'll be discussing today is called Views on Alexander Technique Among UK Higher Education Music Students, Understandings, Benefits, and Challenges. It was first published in 2024 in the International Journal of Music, Health, and Wellbeing. Alongside his research, Federico is an associate lecturer on the MA Music Education program at York and is an active classical guitarist and teacher with experience across conservatory, university, and community settings. So welcome, Federico. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Even before the research we're going to be focused on today, what first brought you to the Alexander Technique?
So I think it was in 2010. I was studying for my bachelor's degree in classical guitar performance, and I was experiencing some discomfort while I was playing and when I was practicing quite a lot. I didn't have any pain, but I was just in discomfort. So I was looking for solutions, and of course I discussed this with my teacher. But then I also, I was quite curious about how to deal with that myself. And so I found that the Alexander Technique was one of the techniques used by musicians to deal, for example, with discomfort, pain, and these sort of things. But I couldn't find any practitioner in my area, so I didn't take any lessons, basically. But then when I went to Sweden to study, I did Alexander Technique group lessons, and I found them really, really useful for my poise and dealing with tensions and these habitual patterns of movement and response. I think I took perhaps 10 lessons, so they were all free, so provided by the institution, so the Malmo Academy of Music. Then when I went to the UK to study for another master's, I took Alexander Technique lessons, so with a practitioner here at York, and I had I think 40 Alexander Technique lessons, so quite a lot of one-to-one lessons, and I found them very beneficial. And then I experienced other teachers, and different ways of approaching the Alexander Technique, so I became very curious and then decided to do a PhD after that.
Talk about that switch to research, because a lot of teachers get engaged with the Alexander Technique, but it's sort of another thing to really want to research the Alexander Technique.
Yeah, so I wanted to do a PhD, pursue a PhD, so I was very interested in research while doing the master's. And so I was discussing with my PhD supervisor potential topics, and I was very into health and well-being of musicians, and then I was having Alexander Technique lessons, so my supervisor actually suggested the Alexander Technique as a potential topic. And I said, oh yeah, that would be something really interesting, because at the time I was hearing different views on the Alexander Technique, and it was quite polarizing. So some students, found it, beneficial, others, didn't like it at all. And so I wanted to unveil this kinds of views within higher education and decided to pursue this for my PhD. And it's been a pleasant experience, to be honest. I heard lots of different views and unveiled, I think, new findings on the Alexander Technique. And that's it.
Let's get into some of those findings. Of course, the paper we're talking about today sort of came after your thesis work. It was informed by it, but also slightly different in nature. So in terms of the paper we're talking about today, what kind of questions were you trying to answer with this paper? And also, why did you choose to focus on students' perspectives instead of sort of getting into trying to just measure the effectiveness of it?
Yeah, good question. And as you said, the paper is basically an extract from my larger PhD thesis, because after the PhD I wanted to publish articles on the Alexander Technique, and in the process of thinking about what would be a good article to begin with, I thought starting with students' experiences would be something really useful for the higher education community and Alexander Technique teachers community. So basically I extracted some of the findings from my thesis, and I wanted to focus on this general understanding of the technique, so how students defined the Alexander Technique, then what the reasons to take lessons would be, and then the benefits of taking Alexander Technique lessons, but also potential limitations and challenges. So I wanted to investigate the Alexander Technique in a quite critical way, so and balance ways, so to look at both positives and potential negatives. And in my thesis, so the thesis itself is larger, and I explored pedagogical aspects of the Alexander technique. So for example, views on one-to-one lessons, group lessons, online lessons. But in the article itself, I focus only on a small portion of student findings. And then to answer the second part of the question, so why I focused on the perspectives.
Yeah.
So my background is in qualitative research. So I wanted to really investigate what students actually thought about the technique. So I didn't want to measure it. Also, I'm not particularly interested, in measuring, for example, outcomes. I'm more interested in what people think about what the outcomes would be. So from the individual perspectives. For example, I interviewed Alexander technique teachers, but in the case with students, so I surveyed students to unveil what they thought, what their experiences were, to have an understanding of what the current situation is.
Talking about from the students' perspective then, if you look at their responses in this survey to all the students, what stood out to you the most in how these higher education music students described what the Alexander technique is, which is, that's always a challenge anyway when somebody says, what is the Alexander technique?
This is, I think, one of the perhaps most interesting aspects of understanding the Alexander technique. So what the Alexander technique is itself, because when people describe it often focuses on what the Alexander technique does or what the outcomes are, but defining what it is quite of a challenge. And in the way students define the Alexander technique, often they refer to the benefits of the Alexander technique or potential challenges, but not exactly what it is. I think we all experience, when we have Alexander technique lessons, where that sometimes, it may be felt as sort of perceived as a body sort of therapy, and not many people, for example, may understand they may be, like more body-mind practice, where there is this interconnection between body and mind. So for many of the students, the Alexander technique is seen as a postural technique, and only a few, those with more experience of taking Alexander technique lessons, highlighted this interconnection between mind and body. But those with less experience with actual lessons, or those who didn't actually have any lessons in the Alexander technique, mentioned that the Alexander technique is about posture. So this idea of postural practice was quite salient.
Well, I definitely see that in other fields. Where do you think that came from for the music students? Their kind of reason for initially calling it posture as their first impression?
So it could be many different reasons. So it could be how, for example, instrumental vocal teachers promote the Alexander technique. So for those who don't have any kind of experience, maybe, you talk with your teacher about, I have pain, or, I can't sit properly. And then the teacher say, yeah, why don't you go and have Alexander technique lessons to solve, these postural issues. So people may think, okay, this may be, a postural technique. So then the way, it is promoted in the institution or more widely. For example, I've seen, in some Alexander technique books and resources that perhaps, more older sources, so this idea of posture and body, whereas in others, there's more, for example, focus on poise and health. So I think also in the resources, there might be this way of promoting the Alexander technique as a more postural technique. Then the technique itself, I'm not sure whether some of the procedures, for example, chair work, could be seen as a sort of postural practice. And when you have loads of Alexander technique lessons, and for me, when I started reading Alexander technique books, I understood what actually chair work was, and the idea of direction, inhibition, and that you're using that to learn all of sorts of skills to stimuli.
We were talking about how students in these higher education music settings interpret it initially. What did you find were some of the reasons that music students chose to try the Alexander technique in the first place? And also, what might have kept others from trying it in the research?
So some of the students, of course, playing-related pain. So, and of course, Alexander technique is one of the methods used to deal with pain. More generally, not that the Alexander technique is for like a pain treatment, but this is why students tried the Alexander technique. So other students, for example, they wanted to solve performance anxiety issues. Some mentions, like performance enhancement, but just a few actually students. But mostly it was all about pain and postural issues, so solving all of these. Others, didn't try first and foremost because of money. Because Alexander Technique are expensive. I mean, for example, even instrumental vocal lessons are expensive. So Alexander Technique is on top of that. And in some institutions, the Alexander Technique is not funded by the university or the conservatoire, so you need to pay for those extra lessons, and students are tight on budget. So that's, of course, one of the issues. Then time, sometimes they need to juggle with very tight schedules. And then there was also skepticism, because the Alexander Technique sometimes could be viewed as a sort of, voodoo practice. I'm not saying that this is, but this might be the perception. I'm not sure if it's about the language or the experiences some teachers want to try to nurture in students. I'm not really sure, but this is one of the reasons why. And so these were the most referred reasons.
Interesting. So for those that ended up taking lessons, what seemed to help them engage with the Alexander Technique in their lessons, find it helpful and meaningful for their own work, and what seemed to sort of make it harder for them to engage with or use on their own?
Definitely, some of the students needed to see the relevance to the instrument. And of course, when you're spending, for example, £45, so you are investing in your health, and you want to try to solve an issue as quickly as possible. So if they found direct relevance of the Alexander Technique in the practice and they saw immediate benefits, of course, there was a plus. We know, so when we have Alexander Technique lessons, that progress, needs time, and maybe you see benefits in the long term. Is not that immediate sometimes, but definitely for some, seeing these immediate results was very important. In terms of, the limitations, so some noticed that, for example, non-doing was quite difficult to do. And of course, in the current times where we are we live in quite a fast-paced society, non-doing, feels quite foreign. Because basically you are expected not to respond to stimuli, not to respond, and it feels quite weird not to do that. And also when we're trying to solve pain, usually we try to do exercises, like how current understanding of how to solve issues is to do more. For example, exercises, going to the gym, go and swim, all of that. Whereas the non-doing aspect of the Alexander Technique is quite different from our current understanding of how to solve issues. So that was a barrier. And for others, a barrier was they found benefits within the lesson, but they couldn't replicate those kind of benefits outside. And in a way, this also connected a bit to my experience. I remember in one of the lessons, I was full of energy. I mean, after I felt really energized, and then never been able to reach the same state outside of the lesson. Yeah. So and so that was quite interesting.
Some of these students then also who did have benefit seem to also have some other impacts beyond music study itself. What kind of impacts did the students in the research describe in their daily life or their well-being, and what do you kind of make of that?
Yeah, so according to the perception of these students, a few of them, they experience benefits to solve anxiety issue more broadly, so that they found that the Alexander Technique helped with that, so managing that. But this is just a smaller percentage of students experiencing that. So I think key takeaway of that is reflecting on the fact that the Alexander Technique could be broadly, not just for performance, for examples, but for all students. So thinking about the Alexander Technique not just as for musicians in terms of performers, but just for anyone. Coming back to this idea of if a music institution asked for help, looking for ways to help students better engage with the Alexander Technique, or let's say they're thinking about putting it into a program, or maybe an Alexander Technique teacher is looking at introducing the Alexander Technique into a higher education music program. What kinds of things might you say or suggest that they say to help music students to engage with the Alexander Technique in those settings? Yeah, I think this is a challenge in the current times where there's lots of financial difficulties, for example, some institutions are facing. So first, we need to think about what kind of institution we are talking about, because music institutions are quite broad, and there are universities, there are conservatories, at least in the UK, because for example some universities in the UK, they don't do performance, and often when we talk about the Alexander technique in the music environment, we tend to refer to a technique used by performers, but we can interpret musicians as a quite broad term. And in universities, for example in music departments, not all music students are performers. Some of them, they do music theory, music history, they are composers, and the Alexander technique sometimes is promoted for performers. And in my research, a few of the students thought that the Alexander technique was for just for pianists. But we know that the Alexander technique is for anybody. Or for example, another student said, I'm a composer, I don't need that, it's not relevant to me. But actually, it could be relevant. So thinking about the music student population is very important. So targeting the Alexander technique to all the student body. And of course, as I said, depends on the institution. So whether you have a variety of subjects within the music domain. And then transparency in terms of definition of the Alexander technique, so make it clear so what the Alexander technique is, what it does, and what the process is, so how it operates. Then institutions could make video resources, so how a lesson in the Alexander technique would look like, so the students are prepared. One of the things I think could be really useful for the credibility of the technique and the promotion of the Alexander technique is avoiding overclaims. Because, for example, when you say, doing the Alexander technique will solve all these issues, and then students take a few lessons and they don't seem to see these benefits, then, could create false hopes, and then the way perhaps, then students may promote the Alexander technique. So I think these are important aspects to reflect on. And of course, we need to accept the fact that maybe the Alexander technique is not for everybody, and they may prefer, other techniques or practices, whatever.
One last question I'd love to leave you with is, what are some areas for you where you see as potential future areas of research of your work or the work in general?
Yeah, I think there are lots of different strands that we could take. It's a pity that I'm not doing any research on Alexander technique at the moment, even though I would like to do more, but fundings are limited and I'll be doing other things. I think it would be really interesting. I like the pedagogical aspects of the Alexander technique and how it connects with instrumental vocal teaching, so instrumental vocal practice. And I know there are a few studies on a triadic lesson, so having instrumental vocal teachers, students and teachers collaborating with each other. So I think that could be explored more, because some students feel that the application of the Alexander technique to their instrument could be quite foreign and difficult. So the sort of applicability and the collaboration with teachers, I think, could be really interesting to research. And I know that for some strands in the Alexander technique community, this could be quite against what the Alexander technique, the nature of the Alexander technique is. So that, this idea of end-gaining. So because when you start applying the technique, it could be perceived as a sort of, end-gaining aspect of the Alexander technique. But I think we need to be also pragmatic if we want to promote the Alexander technique, and perhaps those who want to use the Alexander technique needs to see this relevance. So this collaboration, with teachers could be really interesting. Then thinking about how the Alexander technique may work in other cultural and educational environments. I think, like in Asia, there may be, different perceptions of touching and all of that, because we know that in Alexander technique, touch is often used and is part of your transmission of knowledge and of the experience. So investigating that would be really interesting. And of course, keep investigating into the benefits of the Alexander technique and potential challenges within the lessons, and keeping this critical perspective on the Alexander technique. I think it will improve the image of the Alexander technique within the higher education community, because the more you research about it, the more serious you think you are about the practice. And otherwise it may feel as a sort of close-knit group, and there are perceptions that, for example, the Alexander technique could be a close-knit groups. I'm not saying that this is. there might be this perception. So having this course of critical engagement, as now the community I think is doing a great work in doing that. So there are lots of websites, and for example your work that you're doing with the Alexander Technique and research and the research group. I think this all speaks volume on the importance of having a critical perspective on AT. I think these are the main strengths I would investigate at the moment.
Seems that the more you research it, the more you want to kind of dive into it and research more and understand more about it and communicate it more with others. This has been really great. Thank you so much for your time. I've really appreciated it here. And I'll, of course, include links to the paper below in the article and then to your thesis as well. I'd love to meet up another time in the future and maybe talk about that. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark.